Welcome back, my favorite adventurers and merchants, travelers and storytellers much like myself. Today we find ourselves near the eastern seas, so I only find it fitting that we immerse ourselves in one of my favorite tales, the tale of God's hand. I'm sure all of you natives know the legend, but for those of you who don't, let me reiterate it for you, as it holds bearing on the story that I'd like to tell. Thousands of years ago, stars fell to the earth. Arcadia was ravaged by destruction from the heavens. But from this destruction reigned life, creation. Trees grew from the ashes of the mountains, and seas filled the craters in the dirt. But the waves grew too strong for the world. The god of the seas, Neptunus, rose a hand from the sea to stop the waves. It took every ounce of the god's strength to prevent these waves from crashing into Arcadia and destroying everything. As such, he was forced to remove his own hand and leave it in the eastern sea as a stone monument, a form of protection to the people of Arcadia. Large enough to be seen from the Thornburg port, it stands as a symbol, and any journeys beyond the hand are to be taken cautiously as the waves become furious and turn into maelstroms. And that is where our story takes us today, beyond the god's hand. On the edges of the human kingdom of Arcadia, in Port Osmond, a ship waits in the harbor. A ship with fluttering blue sails, an emblem of a silver eagle large enough for all to see. The crew was upwards of 80 men, a fair-sized vessel. 20 cannons lined the sides of the ship to fight off any pirates or creatures that lurked in the deep. "What's the job today, Captain?" the first mate asked. "Just a standard cargo transport. Waiting on the cargo to show. Prep 20 men to bring it in." "Aye, Captain." The first mate was an older man with ragged white hair pulled into a bun, but he was hulking in size. Most at a glance would have assumed he was some sort of pirate captain, but aboard the Emerald Serpent, only one man was captain, and that was Jareth. He was young for a captain, barely 30 years of age, with shoulder-length brown hair and piercing blue eyes. 2 swords affixed to his hip made him quite the curious figure. What sort of merchant or trading ship needed to be so armed? That's the challenge of the eastern seas, my friends. Beyond the god's hand waits a myriad of threats. The merchants who travel forth beyond into the sea of maelstroms are seasoned beyond their years, and Jareth was no exception. He had fought his fair share of merchants and bandits. He had also taken aboard his fair share of cargo, some more dangerous than others. But what he was to take on today was unlike anything he had ever attempted before. 20 men stood at the docks, but what they found was no cargo that required carrying. It was a woman, but not just any woman. She was cloaked, holding a staff in her hands, and did not speak much. "Let her aboard, men," he said, running over to talk to the dockmaster. This truly was their task. She paid it all up front to the Merchants Guild, which Jared was a part of. "Why was I not informed of living cargo?" The dockmaster and Jareth argued back and forth, until finally the captain let out a sigh. Walking back to the Emerald Serpent, he addressed his first mate. "Let's make our heading, Mr. Wales," he said to the first mate. "Aye, Captain." Looking over to the woman, not many features were discernible. She was young and fair, but there was a power emanating from her. Jareth was no mage, but he had felt his fair share of magic on the seas, and there was something different about this woman. Nonetheless, this was his job. He'd get her to where she was going by any means necessary. The Emerald Serpent set sail on the azure sea. Their goal was a series of islands far to the east, known as the Scorched Isle. The people of the islands often traded with Arcadia, but other than that they generally kept to themselves. It was unlike Jareth to question his mission, but what was her goal there? Observing her cloak for a moment, he recognized an all too familiar insignia on her cloak. A raven. She was a mage of the order. This made him even more curious. "Don't think too much, Captain. The order travel all around Arcadia performing magic. Let's just make it back there in one piece, eh?" "I know. You're probably right. It's nothing." His words said one thing, but His mind dwelt on the mage. And as they grew close to the god's hand, they felt a shift in the waves. The monolithic stone hand looked like it had burst from the sea to grasp the sky itself. Many times had the crew passed this monument, and every time they were amazed. This was living proof of the god's intervention and their safety on the seas. It was a shame that they so often took this safety for granted by venturing beyond it. Jareth felt that was his purpose in life, to brave the most dangerous seas. It made him feel alive. As they passed the hand, the seas began to shake the ship. The mage looked up in a stir. Don't worry. Those are light waves compared to what's coming. Beyond the god's hand. It's treacherous every step of the way. But we've made this journey 100 times. The mage gave a light smile, but there was an ember of concern in her heart. She felt something in the sea, and Jareth could feel it too. They were far more calm than normal. And in the distance, he saw them. Storm clouds. Lightning scattered across the skies. He could see the storm, and in it was something he thought he'd only dreamt of. A serpent in the clouds, just for a mere moment. With the blink of an eye, it was gone. Were the seas getting to him? Had he imagined it? Looking over to the mage, her eyes were fixed on the same spot that his were. Had she seen it too? Those clouds are heading towards Stramford. If we move a bit to the south, we might be able to maneuver around them. I reckon you're right, Captain. Lads, he called out. Adjusting their heading, the seas now became intense. Rain fell to the decks as storm winds fluttered the sails. They were on the edge of perhaps the largest storm they'd seen in 20 years. It blacked out the skies to the north. Nothing could be seen for miles but storm clouds, darkness, and lightning. But the crew of the Emerald Serpent were no amateurs. They raised the sails and prepared the ship. Chunks of wood and iron were ripped from it as cannons rolled across the middle deck. There was damage, but by the end of it, the Emerald Serpent still sailed. Unfortunately, one of the masts was severely damaged, beyond repair that they could muster here on the seas. It seemed like they would have to wait until they arrived in the Scorched Isle. But the mage had other plans. Her journey was to reach the islands, and she intended to do so. Utilizing magic from her pale wooden staff, the mast began to piece itself back together. It was a rather large object, but she managed to fix it. Taking deep breaths, it took a lot of mana to fix such a thing, but she did so seemingly without much effort. Jareth looked at her in amazement and gave a nod. She had put them back on track, but the journey was far from over. Crashing waves and turbulent winds propelled them forward to their destination, but danger lurked in the waters below, rippling through the seas unnaturally. Something was tracking them. The captain could sense it. He had ventured these waters his entire life, and knew what was waiting down below. Once when he was a lad, had his father encountered it. The danger in the deep. Claws grated against the wood of the bow like nails dragging ever so lightly across its prey. While the dragons were thought to be extinct, other dangers still wandered the earth. The elves called it the Noctis Abyssum, deep night. Armed with claws and tentacles, it had ravaged ships for millennia, but often slept more than it hunted. To see this beast was a once-in-a-century occurrence. But the memory of this creature was burned into Jareth's mind, a scar still felt today. Twice in a century, and so close together. The seas were stirring these days. There was no time to dwell. He had to act fast. "Drop anchor now," he shouted. The anchor dropped so fast that the ship spun around to reveal its starboard side aimed at the rippling waters. "Start dropping our black powder barrels into the sea. Do it!" The men were confused as to why they would waste so much black powder, but they did so. "Come, you bastard. Come closer," he whispered to himself. The claw shattered a few of the barrels, sending the powder into the water and rendering it useless. The first mate had taken advantage of this moment to begin pouring oil off the side of the ship as it shifted in the sea. Jareth picked up a black powder rifle and aimed it at one of the barrels. Once hit, the barrel ignited in the water, sending a shockwave that revealed a massive tentacle in the depths. Hissing and growling came from the deep within. Jareth's eyes showed no fear. Cannons fired into the depths, but this only angered the beast. Such malice struck their hearts from below. Murderous intent and insatiable hunger was all this creature felt. The will of man was of no consequence to the deep night, and that was the last mistake it would ever make. "More oil, lads," Mr. Wales called out, and they began to pour it into the water until the sea was black. But the ship was struck, shaking the entire vessel, bringing many of the crew to their knees. A massive hole was ripped in the back of the ship. The beast was smart. It was reading their movements. Jareth quickly grabbed another rifle from one of his men, but a claw was already sent towards the vessel. Fortunately, the mage was already intervening. Sending a bolt of lightning into the claw, it was fried instantly. Jareth grabbed a lantern and threw it into the oil surrounding the ship. Flames lit across the water like a wildfire. To protect the ship from harm, the mage had dispersed the oil in a border around the emerald serpent. From the sea, a large reptile-like head showed its face, eyes darker than the abyss itself. It screeched with enough intensity to shake the ship and create waves as the fire burned its flesh. When the sun began to set, the sea was glittering with orange and red colors. The flames reflected across the azure sea like a wondrous hellscape. It was perhaps the most beautiful, yet terrifying sight any of the men and women on the Emerald Serpent had ever seen. Retreating back to the depths, they could see the water shift as it went back to whatever hole it called home. "Thank you," Jareth said to the mage, who simply smiled. She dispersed the flames for them so they could carry on with their journey. It would not be wise to leave such destruction on the sea, even if it saved them. As they approached the scorched isle, Jareth grabbed a pipe and lit it. While he did not usually smoke, it was his first mate who did. His veins were pulsed with stress. They repaired what damage they could, but with the Emerald Serpent, she'd need help from the people of the island. "That monster is not the only danger threatening Arcadia, I fear," the woman spoke for the first time in this entire journey. "I fear you're right." The two exchanged a concerned gaze before he extended his hand to her. She shook it, and they nodded to one another in respect. "I hope whatever you're doing on that island is going to help." "You have no idea," she said. Landing in the port on the isle, Jareth could still see the storm clouds moving into sternwind. He could only hope they fared as well as they did. Whatever force had brought that storm upon Arcadia was not one that aimed to help it. "Start the repairs, lads. We've got a journey home to fare." Staring into the skies above his homeland, the captain craved the sea. Even after such perils and toil, he only yearned for the adventure and travels across the endless blue. And so he would, until the end of his days. Again, thanks as always, my lovely listeners. Please check out the first episode, Splintered Kingdom, in our new series, History of Arcadia. If you'd like to see more of my work, check us out at Poems and Embers on Facebook, and you can find the link to my book down below. Stay tuned for more episodes, comment, subscribe, like, you guys know what to do, and best of luck on your own adventures. Thanks again.